our PowerPoint here. Okay, can everyone see that and hear me okay? Yep. Okay, if I suddenly cut out or get tackled by a cat and suddenly my sound goes out, their little toes are really great at shutting this off, so just let me know. Okay, so we are working on module 2 today. And this is the cabling standard. So ANSI's ANSI/TIA commercial wiring standard. You will run into that a lot if you're doing anything with cabling. Go click on those and see if you want to see anything more about those as well. So from DMARC to a workstation. So this is just showing you the ANSI TIA structured cabling on a campus network. And as you can see, the DMARC is where it enters in, and then it goes to the ISP. And then you can see where it's showing where everything's moving around for that. And if you have any questions, just stop and we'll chat about it. So entrance facility in building A. So EF is what they're calling entrance facility. And that's the location of the incoming network or intranet. And it connects with the school or corporate network. Then the DMARC or demarcation point, that's the device that marks where the telecommunications service provider network ends and the organization network begins. Yeah, that was always really confusing. When I worked for the state police, I always thought it was funny when I heard ISP. So MDF, main distribution frame, the centralized point of interconnection for an organization's LAN or WAN, also called an MC or main cross connection. Data room, that's where you have your enclosed space that holds all your network connection equipment. Your rack, that's where you have like your rack mounted networking equipment and network servers and all sorts of things. A patch panel, that is a panel of data receptors, which can be mounted to a wall or a rack. And a patch panel provides a central termination point where many patch cables converge to a single location. So this is just basically showing you how to read this inside of a building here. So as you can see, you've got your IDF, and you can see where they're trying to make everything kind of come out of the same area. Doesn't always happen, though. When you have things like remodels, it messes all of that up, too. So this is just showing what, here's your, like when you have your ISP's fiber network, and then you have your Ether network and things like that coming in from a DMARC. This is what a very well organized patch panel looks like. I have seen several that do not look like this, that just have randomly done cables and things everywhere and had to redo them. So if you're very, very lucky, you'll see something like this when you go in. Okay, entrance facility in building A. So VoIP or voice over IP is the use of any network to carry voice signals, and that goes over the TCP/IP protocol. In one or more data rooms, you might find a VoIP gateway, a VoIP PBX, or VoIP endpoints. Data room building B, there is an IDF and an MDF. So an IDF is an intermediate distribution frame. This one provides an intermediate connection between the MDF and end user equipment on each floor in the building. Now, one thing that one always confused me because I'd hear IDF and MDF and my brain would just burp, So just remember that the IDF is an intermediate connection between the MDF and the end user equipment. So work areas in all three of these buildings. So this is workstations, printers, and any sort of network device. Wall jacks, the ANSI TIA standard calls for each wall jack to contain at least one voice and one data outlet. So you'll see that it looks kind of like They look like regular phone jacks. A lot of people will confuse them for them, but those are those RJ45 jacks that we were talking about. And they should have one on top and one on the bottom. And one is, at least one you can use for voice and data. And a lot of times they'll have both of those combined.
And I forgot how people confuse those when the phone line is literally like a tiny square versus like a big rectangle.
Yeah, you would think so, but I've had a lot of people that were like, the phone thing, and I'm like, oh, the network cable. So it's surprising. Yeah. So this is telephony company coming in, and this is the ISP coming in, just showing the differences between there's your voice gateway, your switch, which goes out to your phones, and then you have your VoIP PBX. Now this is the ISP switch. Oops, sorry. Voice gateway, and then you have a legacy PBX. And this is just different ways that you can pull them in. So VoIP equipment can connect through VoIP phones to an analog telephone line or an analog phone to the internet. There's pros and cons to each. Usually from what I've seen, it depends a lot on cost and what is already within the buildings themselves. So if it costs a lot to repull cabling and things like that, then sometimes you'll get the ones where they have kind of the combination of the analog and digital. So here's your MDF, IDF, ISP. So remember, the MDF is the main big guy and the IDFs are the others. So the ISP comes into the MDF, MDF goes out to the IDFs, okay? So rack systems, they come in 2 or 4 post varieties. There are 6 post racks available too, but they're usually 2 and 4. They can be wall mounted or ceiling mounted, freestanding or bolted to the floor. And then consider, there's some things you need to consider when you're purchasing them. Height. It's measured in rack units or RU, with industry standard being 42 units tall. The width, equipment racks come in a standard 19-inch frame, and the rack depth vary between manufacturers. So that's one of those fun things you get to go look up. In data centers containing multiple rows of rack, a hot aisle / cold aisle layout pulls cold air from the vents in the floor or from low-lying wall vents into rows of racks. Now, I've seen some interesting configurations. I've seen one where the entire floor was hollow and then lifted about 2 feet. And so it sounded really weird when you walked over. You heard the clunk, clunk, clunk. And then each tile you could pull up and then get up underneath. So basically all of the cabling was run all the way through under the flooring, and all of the HVAC and everything else.
That sounds amazing.
Yeah, it was a little disconcerting the one time someone set a tile in wrong and I hit it and went right through the floor. That sucked. But
well, the reason I say that is because, like, on all the racks you see in like civilian sector, they have the cables face, or the front of the cable. Can't even think what it's called right now. Where all the cables go into where like the billion RG45 cables go into. They all have those facing out, but the ones in the military, everything's designed to be crammed into tiny spaces, and then you have soldiers crammed on top of them. So those generally, instead of having the cables on the easy to access on the front side, they're in the back, and it comes out on like a sliding track, and you still have to like you've got like a 1.5 foot maybe clearance, and you have to like get up in behind it and try and like tuck your shoulder in to get around to the backside of it. And
yeah,
then
I'm wondering if the person who did that, because it was Idaho State University's ops department that had that one. And I'm wondering if maybe it was a military person that originally did it, because a lot of the stuff did go through the back and then under, instead of going out through the front.
Well, the reason they do it that way in the military is because you have so many people coming in and out in close contact with it that you don't want them to rip one of the cables out.
Yeah.
But because then you have to undo the bundle and everything, rerun, and yeah.
Yeah, I think that's kind of why they did that, because the op, I probably changed the locks. I haven't been in there for quite a few years, but they had people that would come walking through quite a few, and they had their main power drops and everything in there. So I think that they did that so that people wouldn't walk over stuff and, you know, do the same thing. So even the main lab was hollow floor. Can you hear me better? Okay. Yeah, sorry, she's a little bit too helpful sometimes. Yes. But yeah, it was a really interesting because it was my first like ops center that I ever went to. And then when I was in the semiconductor, theirs was all hollow floor in a lot of the different areas too, so they could get up underneath and just yank the flooring out in front of those big machines in certain areas. And it was a little bit odd hearing that clunk, clunk, clunk when you walk over the top of it. Or when they had everything out and you were, you know, basically walking along a big trench. That was a little bit odd too. But it worked really well in order to keep the cooling and stuff going. So that was great. Any questions before I head to the next one? Okay. Nope, we're good. Okay. So a lot of times you see the two that I have seen, in fact, ceiling mount systems I have seen very rarely. They're usually wall mounted or freestanding, at least the ones that I've seen. Just because a lot of times in data centers, you'll either have drop ceilings and they'll put the cabling in through the top, or, you know, like the one I did where they had the drop flooring, where they pulled the flooring up and everything went underneath. So a lot of the times they try to mount it to the wall or the floor because of those two. And here's just some examples of two post racks and enclosed. Don't hit the volume, kitty. Sorry, you guys hear me okay still? Too much help. So, okay, so on the left, there's your open 2-post, and then there's the closed 4-post. And that's the only problem with being out on my laptop. Comfy chair, it's the back be better, but it's lots of help with the cats. So there's some, sometimes you see a combination of both. It really depends on the area security. So if they have an area that's not as secured, a lot of times they'll get the closed ones so they can lock things down a little bit more. If they have an entire secured area, then a lot of the times you'll see the open ones too. This is just an example of the hot aisle, cold aisle, and servers, especially rack servers, get hot fast. So they really have to maintain their cooling. One thing I always liked about getting stuck next to the server room is you always had great air conditioning that way. Cabling, so we had different types of cables. Patch cables, which I think are what most of us are used to. Those are the relatively short length of cables with connectors at both ends. So your toolkit that you guys got had a length of network cable. If you pop 2 connectors on the end, technically that would be a patch cable. Horizontal cabling connects workstation to the closest data room and to switches housed in that room. And then there's backbone cabling. That consists of cables or wireless links that provide interconnections between the entrance facility and MDF, and between the MDF and IDFs. Many network problems are a result of poor cable installations. This is absolutely 100% true. So pay close attention to the quality of cable connections and cable management. because there's a good chance that if you say, hey, this is really not how it's supposed to be done, you're going to get volunteered to redo it. So beware of that. Yeah, poor cable management, poor labeling. That's another one. Sometimes there's people that will get in and just, oh, hey, this doesn't work. So they don't realize that you've used a colored cable system, like green cables go to this, red cables go to this, and they'll just throw whatever into there, and they don't realize that they've just messed up your entire coding system. So, periodic checks are a good idea when you're doing anything with cabling. Okay, so this is just an example of horizontal cabling from a switch in a data room to a workstation. And this shows your cross connection, and it shows, like saying that there's 90 meters out to your data jack, 10 meters to the workstation. This is just a very simplistic diagram of plotting out your cabling. This is an example of, here's your backbone out to the MDF. Here's your patch panels, the walls, the switch, horizontal cabling, wall outlet, and here's another patch cable. Does that make sense to you guys? Any questions on that? Nope. Good. Okay. All right, more cable management. So termination. When terminating twisted pair cabling, don't leave more than an inch of exposed cable before termination. The reason that you don't want to do this is if you leave more than an inch of exposed cable, then you can have fraying and some weird stuff with your cables. Bend radius, do not exceed the cable's prescribed bend radius. That's the radius of the maximum arc into which you can loop a cable without impairing data transmission. Continuity, use a cable tester to verify that each cable segment transmits data reliably. Loosely cinch cables. Now, I've seen a lot of times where people have come into data closets and things like that and just like shoved cables under stuff and bent and crinked and crunched, and then the cables have to be repaired later. So, it may not be the initial person's fault, but be aware that crunching and cinching cables is not good for them. Cable coverings and conduits, avoid laying cables across the floor, and use cord covers if they must be exposed.
If you think that's bad, I watched a Brand New Private use a entire spool of fiber optic cable as a step stool.
Oh, that just hurts.
Fire him right now.
Well, the worst part is it wasn't like they didn't put it horizontal, like because she was too short. She stood it up and like basically wedged it in between two boxes and then stood on the open cable portion in order to get to what she was reaching. And it wasn't even like I don't even remember what she was reaching. I think she was reaching for like cans of air or something.
Oh my gosh.
And I flipped out.
That makes me like makes me sick. I think if I saw that, I'd be like, oh, do you know what you're doing? No, the answer would be no. Yeah, so that's why they try to use cable covers and hardcore covers, and also if you're doing cabling, if you've ever had to deal with state or federal inspectors, if you lay a cable across the floor and it is not underneath something or it is not covered properly, you will get chewed on by the OSHA inspectors. Those are the health and safety people. It's considered a trip and fall hazard, and you can get written up really fast for that.
Filling sandbags for those is fun.
I'm sorry, what?
So for when you're doing a temporary move to a new place, when you're setting up for going from just like, oh, we're going to be here for 12 hours and then we got to set everything up, get connections, and then we're simulating like moving in combat. So you're in a place for like maximum 12 hours. So you still have to set everything up, but instead of burying the fiber and everything like you normally would, you have to dig like a tiny little divot and then cover it with a full sandbag So that way, when vehicles go over it, A, they know there's cable there, but also if it's a sandbag, nothing heavier than a Humvee rolls over it.
Gotcha. That does not sound like fun. I would hate to be the people setting that up and down. Okay, so EMI sources. Installing cable at least 3 feet away from fluorescent lights or other sources of EMI. Do you know, has anyone run into this and knows why you have to do that? Okay, so EMI can cause feedback and all sorts of issues. Magnetic interference can come from like the overhead fluorescent lights, and you can get little testers that really aren't that hard to be able to tell if you're getting from EMI from anything else. And depending on the installation, there are even like shielded network cables that you can use if it's really bad. Yep. It's the shielded networking cables. It looks almost like tin foil that wraps around the stuff, and that's just so you don't get any bleed from other sources that can cause problems with your signal. And then there is plenum cabling. If running cable in the plenum, that's the area above the ceiling tile or before the subflooring or below subflooring, make sure the cable sheath is plenum rated. I just saw someone. Okay, so that's what we were talking about with a lot of the times it's when they do the cable running in buildings, it's above the drop ceiling, or if they have the floor like that, it's below the subflooring like that too. Okay, grounding. Pay attention to grounding requirements. And I have to say, really pay attention to that if you're in an old building, because if someone comes after you later, they can get a good, nice shock. And yeah, drop ceilings are terrible. I have a really funny story about one here in just a second. So yeah, take care to pay attention to your grounding requirements. And if you are near any sort of cabling and you see your arm hair raise, don't touch it. You would be surprised how many times I've had people go, hey, there's like this major static electricity coming off of this thing. That's great. Don't touch it. Go talk to the electrician if you're not working with them. There's something wrong. Yeah, lick it. No, don't do that. But yeah, I've seen it happen to all sorts of things, because in old buildings, like for example, my house was built in 1930, which is just awesome trying to put cabling in, let me tell you. But we found out that they were one of the old practices in order to ground wires was to ground them to plumbing pipes, which is great until you find the shower that it's grounded to. So just remember that grounding can be put all sorts of places. Yeah, I was checking plumbing and grabbed a shower handle and got a nice all the way up to my elbow and was like, hey, there's something wrong with this one. Okay, cable trays. Cable management devices like cable trays. You'll see braided sleeving, furniture grommets. There are tons of different cable devices. There's Velcro ones that you can screw into the wall. Just be aware that you have options in order to keep your cabling out of the way. Patch panels. They showed those there. They're there to organize and connect lines. It's much easier to read a patch panel. Well, if they have done it right, obviously, but make sure that you set up your patch panels correctly, and B, organizing and connecting your lines with patch panel is a big saving time later on. Company standards and inventory. Using your documentation and creating standards and inventory, even if they weren't in place when you got there, will save you time in the long run. So the types of documentation you want to keep, have your cable plant documentation, label your data jack, every data jack, port, patch panel, connector. A lot of times, if you're doing this stuff, you have one of those little label makers that prints off little tiny labels like that, and you just slap them over the top, right over the top of the jacks. A lot of the times, color-coded cables are used. Like, for example, you can use red ones for, like, say you have specific things that you want not to be touched at all. You can always be like, you know, red's this for this is the stuff you don't unplug, things like that. And make sure that you update documentations as you make changes to the network, and make sure that if you have it, I liked to keep a physical copy, because there are some people that just like physical copies for some reason, but I also kept a centralized document for all of that, so that people could just go out and go, oh, okay, this is what changed. So, okay. Any questions on that before I go over to monitoring the environment and security? Oh, no, yep, no.
It's a cable.
Careful, I can boot people out of here. So, data rooms are often serviced, or they're exactly in the same room as HVAC systems, or they'll have like their own separate HVAC system from the rest of the building. They really should have their own HVAC system. Depends on how much people put out for the rent of it. But the reason they should have their own HVAC system in data rooms is that they generally need to be colder than the rest of the rooms. And generally speaking, people don't like to have their stuff down into the 60s, which is where most data rooms are. Specialized products can monitor critical factors of data closets, like unacceptable temperature, humidity, and airflow conditions. Every data room should be locked with limited IT personnel having keys, and security cameras are always a good idea. Okay. Looks like we have a knowledge check. Which of the following causes physical layer failures? SCADA, PVC, STP, or EMI? I did appreciate their use of random things on that one, though. It was quite good. But yes, you guys got it. EMI.
A broken PVC pipe could cause physical failure
depending on what's
issues.
in it. Yeah.
I mean, water pouring into your server room.
That would be
Gonna
bad.
have some
I would have
issues.
to agree. Yes, that would be bad. But you just, if you get a chance to, in whatever company you work for or whatever, even if you're not working in IT, if you get a chance to go look at their data center, even from the outside, it's a good learning experience to look at as many as possible, because you can learn from them and you can go, okay, so this hospital room, the version is different than like an education, like college, or I can guarantee it's going to be completely different than a public school. It's really interesting to see their design features that they choose for the different areas. You're going to see completely different stuff, especially security wise, when you're dealing with anything that has to do with law enforcement versus education. There's a huge shift there. Okay, network documentation. So, up-to-date and detailed documentation of your network is essential for the following reasons. Makes communication with coworkers more efficient, speeds up troubleshooting, and puts information at your fingertips when facing similar problems in the future. I can say one of the biggest problems I've run into at a lot of jobs is lack of up-to-date documentation. So make sure that you're keeping things up to date, just so that you can help your coworkers, and that's, if you run into it again, if you have a similar problem, It's easier for you to go, okay, now how did I fix that? Oh yeah, here's the steps. Network diagrams. So I think we all know, because we've talked about them a couple times, they're graphical representations of network devices and connections. They can show physical layout, logical topology, IP address reserves, names of major network devices, and types of transmission media. Oh, IDOC, that would have been an interesting one. Yeah, that would be completely different, I bet, from what some of the other stuff I've seen. Okay, so network mapping. This is the process of discovering and identifying devices on the network. Nmap and ZenMap, both of which we will use in some later classes as well. Nmap's the most popular. ZenMap is just Nmap with a GUI overlay. Cisco systems set the standard for diagram symbols used to represent network devices. So a lot of times you'll see network diagram making programs, and they'll have specific diagram symbols, and a lot of those actually came from Cisco. This is PowerShell with Nmap. This is them doing an Nmap scan report of an IP address. And then if you look, what we will go over this is that's actually something exactly that we'll do. So the port, it's telling you these 3 ports are open and what they're doing. There's an SSH domain and HTTP. There's your MAC address. And that's just what it looks like when you run Nmap. Here's an example of a very generic network diagram that shows your flow of the basic internet, firewall, router, how your switches come in. Then you have your wireless access point with that, web server, clusters, file server, printer, and workstation. This is just a very super simple, of what it looks like. So network diagrams provide a broad snapshot of a network's physical or logical topology, and they're useful for planning where to insert new switches or determining how a particular router, gateway, or firewall might be interacting. Wiring schematic is a graphical representation of a network's wired infrastructure. In detailed form, it shows every wire necessary to interconnect network devices, and a rack diagram is a drawing that shows devices stacked in a rack system. Now, that's why what they're being used for is why it's important to keep updated maps. And because if you're going to be inserting new switches or trying to figure out how things work together, if you don't have an updated map, you're going to draw incorrect conclusions.
The network, or not the network, what was it? The wiring schematic and the rack diagrams, those would both be part of the physical, correct?
Correct.
And then just make sure that
unless they're planning a wiring schematic, in which case, I guess technically that could be logical, but it should be physical, because you're showing where the physical locations are, and the logical ones, when you're doing those, they can't. I mean, like I won't say they can't, but drawing them out simply it's difficult to, like, okay, this is the stop, this is the, there's not really any super accurate measurements for logical. It's just one of those in the brain concepts that you try to use broad strokes on. Does that make more sense?
All right. Yes,
okay.
Thank you.
And this is another one of those simplistic diagrams, but these little icons that you see here for the switches and the routers, those were brought up or created by Cisco. Here's your typical device installed on a rack. This is what your switches, your patch panel, servers, if you have a security appliance, and the UPS, the universal power switch, which is really nice, especially if you happen to be somewhere that has like those hooked up to a generator. If you have the power go out, it's nice to be able to have a grace period to turn stuff off instead of it just shutting off and taking everything with it. Operating procedures. So these are considered essential documentation items. So logical and physical connections on a network, inventory management, which has become a lot more detail oriented than it used to be, especially with the things like the supply chain security issues over the last couple of years. IP address utilization, vendors, internal operating procedures, policies, and standards. Many corporations establish SOPs or standard operating procedures to ensure consistency. An organization could provide an internal website or database to hold this information. A lot of them do, like for example, if you have anything that requires a policy manual and that policy manual is required to be publicly available, a lot of times you'll see them have a front-facing website where you can just go and look everything else up. It's kind of the same thing. Inventory management. Okay, so SLC, which I'm sure all of us here probably think of something different for that one. So system life cycle is the process of designing, implementing, and maintaining your entire network. It includes removal and disposal of outdated assets, addition of compatible, updated devices. Okay. Inventory management is the monitoring and maintaining of all assets that make up your network. Simplifies maintaining and upgrading your network, and it provides network administrators with information about the costs and benefits of certain types of hardware and software. So the reason that you keep that is a lot of places also have like a 5 to 10 year like rollover plan. It's shorter than that now because, you know, life cycles for technology go a lot faster now. And then they have replacement schedules of, you know, this server gets replaced in 2023, and this one gets replaced in 2024, and this. So there's in order to do those accurate replacement schedules, you have to have really good inventory management. Otherwise, you know, you can't find everything and you don't know what all you need to have replaced. Yeah, there you go. SOP binder and virtual docs. Yeah, a lot of times you'll see a lot of it has gone electronic now. Sorry, I have a very active cat that keeps running over the top of my laptop. And because it's just easier to produce and give it out virtual, like SharePoint or things like that, a lot of them use that because it's just easier to have a repository than it is to have to worry about physical documents. Yeah. Bean counters, yeah, they generally like to have all the plans in check before anything happens. Okay, so labeling and naming conventions, as you can see, can get quite complicated. So tips for labeling and naming conventions. Use names that are as descriptive as possible. Only include fields that are essential in identifying your device. Do not overcomplicate the name with useless or redundant information. Use established naming conventions. Think big picture down to details. Consider any security risks from details included in your naming conventions. Use color-coded cables and use cable tags to identify each cable's purpose. Label the ports and jacks that cables connect to. Where labels won't fit on a device, draw a simple diagram of each device that indicates how each port is used. Use labels that are durable and are designed to stick to plastic and metal. A lot of the times I've seen everything from those embossed labels like they use in construction to label printers. And I've actually seen some of them where they use etching devices. So you never know what's going to be used for labeling, but make sure that whatever it is going to stay there. Okay, a lot of them have these, as you can see, the port label with the tags. The only problem is that if you have them stuck, you need to make sure that they're not going to come off, because that happens a lot. Or if you write on the cables or things like that, that's not always, they'll rub off or things like that. So just keep those in mind when you're labeling. And this is just
clear duct tape is your friend.
Yeah, clear duct tape can work quite well. There was I've seen some where they have the bigger labels and they just basically wrap the clear stuff around it to keep it in place. Just make sure that whatever you do is legible and sticks. That's all I have to say about for that. So here's a simple diagram of a Cisco router, and the red labels identify how 5 ports are used. And this is just a super simple example. So this one goes out to this accounting, probably accounting gateway. IT goes here, human resources, sales. And this one here, this one goes out to the WAN. So, the bigger they are, the more complicated they're going to get. But a lot of times you'll have this one's dedicated and it goes out to this server, or this one's dedicated, and they'll have actual like numbers and naming conventions, hopefully by the time you get there, that are already printed out and put in their documentation, so you can just read that. Okay, business documents. Okay, so a lot of these you're going to see over and over and over and over again, no matter what courses you take. So these are good ones to either pull up or write down the names of, because you will see them. So an RFP is a request for proposal. If you're doing anything with vendors, you have them do a request to submit a proposal for a product or a service that you want to purchase. For example, when I was at the school district, I was tasked with finding a new junk mail, like a spam filter. And there were 3 different, I went out and looked at a whole bunch of different types, but there were 3 different companies that I found that were in our price range. Seemed like they would work, because we had to do things with government funds and things like that. So I approached them, talked to their sales team, and told them all, if you're interested, I need you to put a request for proposal together for me. And then if I like what I see, I will set up a time for a meeting with you. Okay, an MOU is a memorandum of understanding. Documents the intentions of 2 or more parties to enter into a binding agreement or contract. You'll see this a lot in contract work. Sometimes you'll see this in courtroom documents too. Statement of work, or SOW. This one in the detail of work that must be completed for a project, for a particular document. So if you do any project management courses, you're going to see that RFP, MOU, and SOW in there, because they're kind of basic things that you are going to be asked to do. And SLA, all of us have seen at some point or another, and that is the service level agreement. It's a legal binding contract or part of a contract that defines the aspects of a service provider to a customer. So your ISP, those long Apple ones that you see, they're everywhere. I know for a fact everyone has seen one. So these are just some more. MSA, or a master service agreement. That one is a contract that defines the terms of future contracts between parties. So examples include like your payment terms, or arbitration agreements. Usually those are like, you'll have a small one and then they'll say, here's your master service agreement. It's one of those ones that you want to read very carefully if you're doing contract work. And then there's master license agreement. This one grants a license from a creator, developer, or producer to a third party for the purposes of marketing or sublicensing or distributing the product to consumers. If you've ever dealt with anything having to do with media licensing, this one is, you'll see this a lot of times in those, you can use such and such product, but you can only use it for the express purpose of education, or you can't change it without express rights from blah, blah, blah. That's master license agreements. Okay. Knowledge check. Which network diagram shows logical topography? Rack diagram, network map, floor plan, or a wiring diagram? Okay. Good job. Good job. Network map. So this was network mapping is the process of discovering and identifying the devices on a network, which is your local topology. Good job. Okay, change management. Now, this one is one that I've seen more of an emphasis on in the last 5 years, and I'm really glad for, because a lot of times they'd be like, okay, this is in place. It's never ever going to change again, which doesn't work that way with IT, because as we know, it changes constantly. So managing change while maintaining the network's efficiency and availability requires good planning, and I'd say advanced planning as well. Network users need to know when to expect certain network resources to be unavailable. That's why there's those emails that you get from like your bank or some other place where it says server will be down from like 9 p.m. on Wednesday to whatever. They're usually for server maintenance windows is what they're usually for. Common software and hardware changes range from installing patches to replacing your network backbone. You also may need to know the change management documentation that might be required for an enterprise scale network. So enterprise scale networks are significantly larger, and usually change management documentation, remember me talking about that every 4 years we need to replace XYZ. A lot of them will have a big spreadsheet for funding purposes, and we'll talk about which areas they want to work on upgrading and when, as for their enterprise scale networking. Questions on that before I go on? Nope. Okay. Software and hardware changes. So we have the 4 types of software changes. Installation, which is the new software will be installed to relevant devices and incorporated with network resources. Patches, this is correction, improvement, or enhancement. Upgrades, which are major change to software package that enhances the functionality and features of the software. Or a rollback, also called back leveling or downgrading. And that's a process of reverting to a previous version after attempting to patch or upgrade it, usually because it's caused problems. Hardware changes could include adding new security cameras, replacing workstation, installing printers, or upgrading other hardware. Same change management principles apply to any type of change. Process all changes through proper channels, minimize negative impacts on business procedures, plan thoroughly to maximize the changes of a successful change on the first attempt, and document each change throughout the process. One thing that we learned as an IT department was when they're talking about minimizing negative impacts on business procedures, lack of communicating that you're going to be doing changes has a negative impact upon your department. If you're an IT department, they get mad if you do a lot of changes within a short period of time, whether they're good or not. People just a lot of people just don't like change. So you have to schedule and dole out things that are going to change rather than hit them with a bunch of changes at the same time. So generally, the larger the organization, the more documentation required when making changes. You may need to do some of the following: submit change request documentation, understand and follow an approval process, follow project management procedures. There are specific procedures for project management, and larger organizations might require you to go through the whole thing. Provide additional documentation that could include network configuration, IP address utilization, if there's any sort of additions to the network, and if you're going to be doing any sort of physical location changes, and then close the change. Now that the lesson is ended, you should be able to, and there's all the different things that we were talking about. So just remember, label, 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 but make sure you can read it and it's going to stay. Go look at your networking cabling diagrams. It's one of the first things I recommend if you're going to a new workplace, if you're going to be working in the IT department. Make friends with your network administrators and ask where all of the documentation is shared, because you never know, you might learn some new things there as well. Okay, are there any questions? Questions about cabling? Questions about cables? Questions about network diagram? Anything? No.
Well,
Yep.
Will knowing about network cables be a large portion of this course?
I will also use a camera to show you how to use the tools to strip the ends off and put an RJ, so you can basically build your own networking cable for the next 2 classes. That's why we sent you guys the toolkits and the stuff for it. But I have to be able to sit in the right spot in order to use that particular camera. So I'm sorry I wasn't able to do that for you guys yet. But yes, knowing about network cables and physically how they work is a big part of the class, but it's this class and the next class. Because networking in and of itself is the basic foundation for so many attacks in cybersecurity. I think that's why they made it such a big deal for this particular course. Any other questions? Well, the camera that I'm using, I went out and got a different camera because when I tried to show stuff on the one that I have, it's really difficult when you're doing stuff up here. So I got one of the document cameras that comes down and it actually shoots in 4K. So you guys should have an easier time seeing. It has like the little light and everything that go down, and then you'll be able to see me working on a flat surface so that you can see how I walk through, and I'll walk through it while I'm talking to you guys. So if you're like, hey, can you go back and show me what that is, then I can go back and either strip it again or do whatever we need to do to walk through it again together. I think we're probably going to be working on that as just kind of an in-person lab, not this week, but next week, because I want to be able to show you guys the right way to do it and get you guys a good video for how to do it too. Any other questions? Yes, no? Okay, looks like everyone seems to be doing okay. So for tonight, go out, do your Cengage stuff. If you have time, get some of the Cisco stuff going. And then tomorrow I will work on Cisco with you guys. I've got some Cisco slides and lecturing for that stuff. And then I will work on the packet tracer stuff with you guys tomorrow night. So if you have any questions, stick around. Otherwise, guys, have a good night.